Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. In today's episode, Virginia discusses the undeniable nature of truth, the pervasive influence of modern propaganda, and how reclaiming our ancient historical roots of sovereignty is essential to surviving the battle for our minds. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Truth. What is truth? That's a big topic, right? The truth is impossible to suppress for any length of time. At the end of the day, laws of nature are not subject to the scrutiny of public opinion, nor will they ever bow the knee to popular opinion. Laws of nature are irrefutable. They are universal, number one. Number two, they're self-evident. They're obvious to all. But given the complexity of the human condition, if you will, well explained by our depravity, and I think we're all aware of our own limitations, it's self-evident. But sometimes those two things I just mentioned don't make it possible for us to bend the knee in humility and say, I was wrong. Perhaps I'm ignorant about that topic, right? Which, when we're wrong and when we're ignorant about a given topic, it's obvious to everybody else, but what do? We double down on our ignorance and our not having information and act like we do. But in fact, we're dumbfounded and we do and say stupid things. We're in a stupor. But what's dangerous about not acknowledging laws of nature that are obvious to all is we're neglecting to speak truth about our ignorance, about the fact that we're dumbfounded, and about the fact that we're in a stupor now. And when there isn't a sense of humility, which would be the truth, right, about those three things, what happens? Then we become fools. And fools are dangerous because they become very destructive to protect their position. So when we talk about this idea of truth, this concept of truth, what is it? Truth floats. Truth is undeniable. Truth is a law of nature. It is self-evident, and it does appeal to our natural affections. Not always on our timeline, because we're ignorant, we're dumbfounded, and we're in a big stupor about many things. But when we're not willing to acknowledge those things, what happens? We embrace a body of lies. One of my favorite quotes by Churchill, Winston Churchill, the truth is so important that it's surrounded by a body of lies. Because once you can access the truth and there's a rip in the fabric of deception, what happens? Freedom is unstoppable. But if we don't show up to this conversation to discuss what's true and what's not with a measure of humility, curiosity, and respect for the person who holds a position, then we're all going to be sunk because all we'll do is attack each other. There has to be a measure of dignity for our common ignorance, for the propaganda, let's just be practical right now, that's enslaving not just a generation here in America, but the world. There is the truth is surrounded by a body of lies, like Churchill said. And we need to become disciplined at pursuing truth. And to do that, I think there has to be a measure of humility and kindness and sensitivity for the fact that we're in this together. And if we attack each other in the pursuit of what's true and what's not, then nobody's left standing. What comes naturally to us is fear, anger, covering, hiding, blaming. What comes natural intuitively is all that governs our central nervous system. And we always say that has complex stories that didn't just begin in our home. They're the product of generational dynamics. Epigenetics speaks powerfully to all this. We have a lot of science to substantiate all of this. And at R.E.S.T, we leverage that data to help people step into wellness and wholeness and freedom and experience healing. So what comes natural, though, is the tension and the desire to be loved, to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. There's a hole in our heart to desire that thing that we were hardwired to experience. But it takes spiritual disciplines. It takes measures of humility. It takes facing the limitations of our common humanity with integrity to show up with curiosity when we encounter each other. And I think that's the catalyst for the necessary humility we need to begin to displace the seriousness of the confusion, chaos, and disease that is upon us, because it's dividing families. It's dividing communities. It's dividing nations. And I think we have a very unique opportunity to really close our mouth, open our eyes to new dimensions, and open our ears. And again, open our hearts to things that are happening perhaps outside of all of our assumptions, presumptions. For example, case in point, I work very closely with first responders. We do. And people that are in the front lines of the collapse of a nation. They're the guys that show up when all of us call in panic because laws are being broken or tragedies are happening. Okay? We don't work just with first responders and with police, fire, border, and all aspects of our first responder community. But we serve people in intelligence as well. And at the end of the day, no matter what walk of life you are in, we're all trying to displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease that is afflicting us. But these people are the first to get the call from homes, communities, and from our nation. Multiple people that I've worked with served in the FBI and in the CIA, not for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And their perspective is in alignment with one fact. In this school, if you will, of public opinion, there are these narratives. But in fact, what's happening behind the scenes is a complete different story. And they see that it is a fight for who is going to write the script on truth. Who's going to control the narratives that will manipulate public opinion the quickest? And there is a war raging for your mind, your heart, your will, your conscience, your feelings. The psyops that we've watched in movies and the mass manipulation is what we're experiencing here in our homeland. Thankfully, we live in a democratic republic. We're not a democracy. We are a republic where people still have a voice to say, wait a minute, something is not right here. And the turbulence of the last, 8, now going into 12 years is a struggle between those two narratives. And there's been a rip in the fabric of deception that has compounded over the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. And it came into the front doors, obviously, of political rhetoric, of education, of science, of everything. So now we're seeing that there's been competing narratives that didn't always have the best interest of the individual at heart. And that's what we're seeing now. And we have personal responsibility to displace our own ignorance so we can stop being dumbfounded by the absolute measure of corruption we're all experiencing, and to refuse to live in the stupor we find ourselves in. so that we don't die by virtue of our own foolishness. And I think that's what we're facing here. Easiest invitation to our listening audience is this: no, you're not crazy. There is light and there is dark. There is good and there is evil. There is good energy and there's bad energy. There is truth and there are lies. And you need to put everything you ever thought that you could trust on the margin, besides the universal, which are laws of nature that are irrefutable. We talk about them a lot here. And one of them is life. Does this thing advance or diminish my life? The second thing is, this is obvious. So what's obvious to me that violates my conscience, why are they shoving it down my throat and telling me it is okay? Something's wrong here. And I know this is, I'll pick a controversial subject, okay? Not this last election, but the election before was evidence of people being outraged and saying no more. The last election was just too big to rig. Why? Because the previous election, we had to believe that the last presidential candidate before this one got more votes than Barack Obama. They were more votes of people that were even registered to vote. The deception and the corruption was everywhere. We had film, we'd have everything. But instead, what happened? We went along with the Constitution and everything it permitted for us to do. But when January 6th hit and they were talking about an insurrection, I know people that were there. And I had firsthand reports that we don't even know how things escalated to that point. Something was like wrong. There was no call to arms, call to go interfere with the democratic process. There was no calls to do any of that. Why do I know? Because I can name 7 people that were in the front row of the whole thing, and they were so perplexed about everything that unfolded. So common sense told those of us that were there, something's wrong. He didn't say that. They didn't do that. We don't even know how this thing escalated. So there was some kind of engineering. So who stood to win from the confusion, chaos, and disease? And of course, there's billions of dollars now in lawsuits flying all over the place. Attorneys are very busy because the gig's up. And now emails have been uncovered. The rejection of Trump offered 15,000 or whatever Secret Servicemen and whatever to help to make sure that everything was up and up, but they were rejected by those that were entering into power that had a whole other agenda. So there are some very accessible, true things. So I guess the question is a narrative that's being advanced, does it expand life, the life of liberty and freedom and everything that is America, or does it diminish it? What are the voices that are telling you, trust us, we'll take care of you, instead of, no, you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourselves. We need to make sure those rights aren't taken away from you. So what are those competing narratives, right? So we all have to, and this isn't a Republican or Democrat thing here that I'm talking about. I'm talking about there are massive amounts of propaganda that are vying for our very sanity. And we need to take personal responsibility to get to the heart of what is true and what's not. And if we blew it for any reason, don't worry. Truth floats. It will never fully be suppressed. Winston Churchill was hated by so many. He didn't just rise up as a voice of reason to fight the advancement of the Third Reich, but he had to fight all the naysayers that wanted him thrown out of office. He's one person I want to sit down and have tea with when I get to heaven. But he saved the West from the tyranny of what became the Third Reich. Now, at that time, the world did not know the influence that the Third Reich was having on the world, specifically who became Fidel Castro's right-hand man, and the spread of communism. We didn't know any of that, but look at the stuff that's coming out from scholars and academics that were in the front line and the inner circle of those discussions, but it was too crazy to believe. Nobody could believe that that in fact was happening. And it was. And it didn't even impact just what was happening with Castro, but it had a huge effect in the top leaders of what would become the Palestinian state. Nobody knew the Yasser Arafat, if I'm not mistaken, and you guys fact check me on this, was mentored by one of Hitler's right-hand guys. So now you find a different expression of incredible confusion, chaos, and disease of the age that was manifesting and had its fingerprints all over what we value, and that is people's capacity to exercise their individual liberty to secure freedom, people's capacity to live free. And now here, 50, 60, 70 years later, we find the unification of those three worldviews, of communism, of the Islamic agenda and worldview, and certainly the dictatorship of China and whatnot, and all those different worldviews, collaborating against the voice of liberty and freedom. And I invite everyone to do their own research, because that's what we're up against right now. And you can call them global. I don't know. It's all too big. I don't know. But you have people like Charlie Kirk, and I'm one person removed from him. It's a matter of fact, we were trying to get together, but he had an insane schedule to discuss the very nature of what is happening when there's such an effort to suppress honest discourse that can displace the growing confusion, chaos, and disease. And worse than that, we're criminalized for desiring platforms and opportunities for open and honest dialogue. Who stands to gain by shutting that kind of conversation down? Maybe that was too long of an explanation. I'm not smart enough to make this any shorter and any more concise. And I'm so in the trenches of working with the individual's capacity to restore their sovereignty within their own spheres of influence that I'm really not an authority on these global issues. But I'll tell you what is happening to me. There is an awakening taking place. It's a matter of fact, there's a great movie out right now. It's called The Great Awakening. And everybody listening to us today, Democrat, liberal, communist, whatever your worldview, I love you all, because you guys are my brothers and my sisters. But I invite you to become curious about these complex narratives of ancient history, American history, and universal history, because I think you're going to find great hope in that pilgrimage. Why ancient history? Because those that were responsible for establishing this republic were scholars, not just of the human condition, but of how the workings of governments throughout history, every government throughout history, they took close inventory of their rise and their falls. And they reasoned that the framework established in the scriptures, the Holy Scriptures, it gave an account for that narrative of man that was consistent with well-documented history, had a lot to say, in addition to the rise and falls of government, about the human condition and the ideas that would establish a republic that had the greatest likelihood to secure the freedom of its people, only if they had the moral courage and the fortitude to self-govern could freedom be protected. That's a story of the United States of America. That's it, right there. These men weren't just ordinary men that sit down. And by the way, they had what? Impassioned debates about what? The ideas that would most likely secure the sovereignty of this republic. Go see the movie A Great Awakening. It's in theaters all over. It will be available through one of these platforms that movies are streamed from, I am sure. But there you're going to see religion, science, and government, and the giants that were behind advancing the ideas that would establish this republic, this constitutional republic. And that's the truth about America. But you're going to have to dig, because if you think you're going to go read the truth from current commentators and from current historians, you better dig deep about their worldview and their view of reality and God and science and everything. But I'm telling you that as an agnostic and as an immigrant, I became a Christian because I read the Federalist Papers. And it was in direct opposition of information I was getting from my history book. And this was way back in 78, 79. And in an AP class, we didn't have AP classes at the time, but imagine this was required reading. The Federalist Papers was required reading for my history class. And I thought, somebody's lying. And I know I mentioned this numerous times. There it goes. There goes that word, lying. Why would they lie? Why would they distort the truth about the history? Why would they be omitting primary sources from the history books? Why are they interpreting what I can read for myself? Why are they telling me what to think, how to think it, and why? And why are they only giving me 3 options? Fill in the blank, connect the dots, true or false. Why aren't they letting me write and reason about this? And that's when that quiet, still voice that I heard as a little girl, somebody's lying here. That's when it began to take different form and structure. Francis Schaeffer, and I think I recommended his books last time. Escape from Reason, number 1. And How Then Shall We Live? And we don't have time to break that down, but perhaps we need to. And I need to dedicate a whole podcast to Francis Schaeffer. Why? Because he predicted that we would be here and we would begin to see the beginning of the end of history as we've known it, should literally the ecclesia, if you will, not rise up and speak truth to power. Because the role of the ecclesia is not the church as we understand it. The role of the ecclesia are those that understand the work of a kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, having the strength and the courage to speak truth to power, that it is the responsibility of those whose lives have been transformed by the knowledge of the truth, to rise up and displace lofty ideas and arguments that rise up against the truth. It is the responsibility of every believer to contend in the arena of ideas with anything that rises up against the truth for the sake of what? Securing our rights as sovereign individuals to live free. So it is the responsibility, not of the church, of the ecclesia. The church is not a building, it's not an establishment. Christ is the only leader who is very political, if you will. His government was not of this world. And we find the transformation of that in what? In the hearts of man. And Exhibit A, go read beyond the headlines, the secular headlines of what's happening in Iran. You are watching the ecclesia, the government of God, rise up in a nation that has been hijacked for, 49 years. I'm old enough to have witnessed that. And the people, hook, line, and sinker, believed and sat like sheep to the slaughter as their government was taken over by a worldview and an ideology that promised them everything and delivered nothing. It's a matter of fact, it took their lives. I heard from the administration that the people could care less about the bombing because they're dying anyway. Kill this cancer in our midst. Even if it's costing our lives, we'd rather die in a blaze of glory. I mean, that's enough to drive us to tears. I heard one Iranian say, "What right do you have in America to tell us what we need? You have no idea the hell we live in." They gladly give up their life right now for freedom. Whatever and whoever you have to destroy our infrastructure, this cancer's got to end. We're dying anyway. And that's why, and I believe the numbers are going to be in the hundreds of thousands, if not over 100,000, of the brutality that the regime has inflicted upon the people. So I have several Islamic friends. I have many friends that practice Islam. I'm not speaking against them. I'm talking about the truth that's right in front of us every single day when the people do not want to die anymore and perish and be persecuted under the hand of tyranny, but will gladly give up their life for the hope of freedom. That might not sit well with Americans that have been indoctrinated, but as an immigrant, I am telling you this is the total truth. And brace yourself. I know firsthand exactly what happened in Cuba, and so does the rest of the world. While our college students, and in mass numbers, were being indoctrinated that we're the bigots, we're the liars, we're destroying the world with our worldviews. Look, America's got its problems. We're fighting the corruption in the front lines every day, okay? And without getting into specifics, we know what's happening. We're not blinded to the fact that our politicians sold their soul for $1. And sold America for $1. But isn't that the history of man? Power, greed, and lust, their own depravity. But guess what? It's all going to die a natural death because truth floats. This is not America's final story. This is our brightest moment. But I wonder what our individual price is. I wonder what we're willing to give up to speak truth in love, without berating each other. When the point you're making becomes more important than the love you have for the people you're making it to, stop talking because the battle's over. And at rest, we go through great pains to engage with love, integrity, never losing sight of what's sacred, to engage everyone we work with in that conversation. There's no getting around the situation I guess we're finding ourselves in, and that is to contend for truth. There's only going through it. We can't get around it. But as we go through it, I want to invite us to remember that truth is always offensive. The truth is offensive because our condition is perilous without a hunger for the things of God that are good and give and advance life. And there was no greater leader that ever lived that advanced those ideas of light, life, liberty, love, and law like Jesus Christ did. He embodied all those things. And there's only one other worldview that advances their agenda as well, to pursue God with the antithesis of all of those things. There's no light in it. There is no life in it. There's no liberty in it. There is submission to a regime. There's no love in it. It's driven by the ideology that you become a law unto yourself for the end of reaching God. And it's the antithesis of the Christian worldview, completely incompatible with the ideas that are advanced by the government of this republic. So we need to have the moral courage and the moral strength to speak truth and love without disparaging each other so we can advance the cause of everything that gives life. And it's impossible to do it all without relational, emotional, and spiritual truth, because we all, at the end of the day, need to reconcile the conflict that is at war within ourselves. Do we live consistent with our own convictions? And more often than not, the answer is no. So then we better stop insulting each other and get our own house in order. The anatomy of cancer speaks in the most powerful ways. So without going on and on and on for everybody, I want you to think about this. From the beginning of time, we have a narrative that says, hey, I made you like me, a spirit, a soul, and a body. And not only did I make you like me, but I'm explaining to you everything that's going to sustain your life in the first few sentences of this story I'm telling you about you. In the beginning, there was time, space, and matter to sustain the spirit, the soul, and the body that I'm going to give you to live like me. And by the way, balance, harmony, and coherence of everything will be the spine of your life. And then I'm going to put you in this garden that has everything in it to sustain and advance your life. And I'm going to walk with you in that garden. But because I made you to be like me, I'm going to put something in the center of that garden, and it's going to be beautiful. They're two beautiful trees. And you get to choose, because if you don't have a choice, you can't exercise the liberty to secure your own freedom. And in the center of that garden, I'm going to tell you a little bit about government. Because see, if I don't give you the capacity to self-government, then you don't have any free agency to do anything but be my robots. So I want you to choose me, but let me tell you something about those trees. If you eat of this one, you will have full knowledge of good and evil, and you'll begin to die. But this is the tree of life on this side. So this is the only place that I'm putting some parameters, and I'm giving you one law. Because if you don't have one single law, you can't be free. If you don't know what the standard of advancing or diminishing life is, you can't be free. You have to have a choice. So I'm going to place you in the middle of this, and I'm going to be walking with you every day. A great cultural anthropologist by the name of Charles Kraft, Dr. Charles Kraft, taught at UCLA for years. And then he ended up at Fuller for many years. He said, Virginia, we don't know how long that period was or how many years he walked and talked with them. But we do know that the first humans lived almost 1,000 years. And we also know that there was another entity, another being, another creature, if you will, that wasn't an image bearer, but he was a creation of God that also had sovereignty and free will. But he didn't have the image of God, not a spirit, not a soul, and not a body. He was a little bit different. And he comes into that narrative and into that drama, if you will. And it's very interesting because he went to Eve. The command of do not eat was given to Adam. Eve came after that. Because we're told that God, this personal, intimate God that made them for his pleasure, by the way, to have full communion with created beings that had sovereignty like him. He told Adam, do not eat of this tree. He gave the command to Adam, not Eve. And then Eve comes into the stage and she's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And it's kind of interesting because the name he gives her, right, is, and I forget, Ezra or something like that. I forget exactly what it is at the moment. But she was this thing that was to complete him. And her function in this union that Adam had with God was equal or similar to that of the spirit that completed and taught. It was beautiful. It's multidimensional, if you will. Kind of wild, like the Holy Spirit. She kind of had some essence of that. And Bible scholars, well, more versed than me on this, will, yeah, have fun searching this out, you guys. I invite everybody to, because it's pretty fascinating. And I did it one time, but it's not where my curiosity landed me. I just think it's beautiful how I reasoned that government began with God, who directed, regulated, controlled, and restrained himself in creation. But he also created an ecosystem in which man could have full authority to govern, to rule, and overrule in. And he made man to be like him, and he gave him full authority to do what? Be fruitful and multiply. The implications of that is way more than sex, by the way. To subdue, right? And then to have full dominion over, which is amazing. There's another pattern of 3. And in that beautiful narrative, we find really the mystery of what thousands of years this little peon of a person, this little pee-wee person, me, found these patterns of 3, 6, and 9 that were so captivating that they ended up really saving me from my own depravity. And exactly 1,100, I think, in 94 years, almost this last Easter, to the date of when Christ came into time, that I would discover the narrative of this complex story woven into the meaning and purpose and value of our own story. And every book from Genesis to Revelation speaks of the mystery of that pattern and the redemption of that story, because we know at the end of the day, Lucifer went to Eve, not Adam, which is kind of interesting because he couldn't really quite get Adam to rebel against God without deceiving him. And deception came in through Eve. In the confusion and the chaos and the dis-ease she began to feel with the questions that Lucifer prompted her with, right? Hey, did God really say? That was the first one. And then the statement, you're not going to die. And the other statement then, right? He's holding out. He doesn't want you to be like him. Those were the things that ultimately seduced her as she's defending God, right? But I think it's interesting that he went to Eve to deceive her, not Adam. And why is this narrative important in the context? Is because the only hope of choosing an alternative to God is confusion, chaos, and dis-ease, and questions that undermined our identity. He undermined God's sovereignty, and then he undermined our identity. Because Lucifer, think about it, seduced her with everything they already had. Everything in heaven and on earth was given to them through delegated authority. They just had to keep it. Nothing's free, remember? Freedom isn't free. The price of freedom is liberty, is you dying to your all good intentions and to yourself to secure what God promised you. And it began in the garden, really. But they didn't know what was happening. Lucifer, remember, was the brightest and most beautiful and brilliant angel, and he seduced them with lies. The truth is so powerful that it's surrounded by a body of lies, and there you have it in the first narrative that he had with God's children. But what I love about God is the liberty that he gave man and the right that he gave them if they use their liberty to secure freedom. And that story, by the way, hasn't changed. We talked a little bit in the last episode, and that story just hasn't changed. In short, the confusion, chaos, and dis-ease at the fall became part of our physiology and our anatomy. I always refer to that as the human condition. And the human condition is the desire to become a law unto ourselves. in spite of the fact that there's quiet, still voice that knows that we're violating our conscience. And that's the battle. But it's the battle, but it's also the glory of God. Because when we tap into that truth, that there's a battle that rages within us, and we declare war against it for truth and for everything that is integritous, then guess what? The gig's up and evil doesn't have that, or darkness, or death, if you will, or depression, or anxiety, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have that kind of power over us. Life is easy. Life is freedom from darkness, from death, from anxiety, from depression, from all these things that we're told we're slaves to now. No, we're not. And we prove that at R.E.S.T every day. No, we're not enslaved to any of those things. But we have to understand and be willing to identify the battle that we have against ourselves and have dominion over it with the ideas that advance life and liberty and freedom. But that costs something. Freedom isn't free, and it does cost us something. It costs us money, it costs us popularity, it costs us fame. We've been there. It costs us all the trappings of the world. That's what it costs us. And that's okay. Because on the other side of all those price tags is freedom. And you know the people that are free? Because they're not afraid to engage in any discussion, in any argument, or to rise up and reason against ideas that are false. And they're able to engage with measures of integrity to the front lines of those discussions. Not that we do it perfectly all the time. And Exhibit A, Charlie Kirk. Now, in our freedom, can we sometimes be sloppy and a little bit arrogant and tired? Of course. We've all seen and heard things Charlie has said that it's like, oh, I don't know if I would have said that. But you know what? I wasn't working 18-hour days on a stage with a mic in my hand. You know, he gave up a remote control for a mic. You know, it's easy to be critical that maybe somebody wasn't on point all the time, but exponentially, 90% of the time, he just kept getting deeper and deeper, deeper and deeper and deeper into the narratives of what was at the root of propagating the dissension. And that's why he was killed. But isn't that what happens to all of us to some extent? We're going to be destroyed by something. The closer and closer you get to exposing evil and the truth, it's going to cost you a little bit more. But then what's the cost of what you're doing? If it isn't your life, then you can be bought. I thought it was a beautiful thing for him, not for the rest of us, but for him, that he went home doing exactly what he knew he was called to. And that was to displace the lies and the growing confusion, chaos, and disease of the age, regardless of how you feel about him, whether you like him or not. I don't know anybody that lived truer to his convictions and the things that he knew than Charlie Kirk. And he rallied the affections of a generation. And the domino effect of that will continue for generations to come. Kingdoms reign. There's a kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God that is the dwelling place of man, and the kingdom of the world. People have to begin to understand that there are spheres of government in the spiritual, in the soul, the psychological, and manifesting in tangible ways. I mentioned what's happening in Iran. And we have to see that these kingdoms, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the world, are in conflict. There is a war raging. And the players, the true players, are bigger than many of us are willing to acknowledge. And it's between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the devil. And we don't have to look beyond evil to see how that manifests in time. Nor do we have to look too far to see the kingdom of God at work in the hearts of man. And I work with first responders. We're at the front lines of seeing what that looks like. If we don't have the moral courage and the spiritual conviction to say there is a bigger war that is raging above, within, and around us, then we're going to miss the mark. We're going to be crippled by fear, which is wondering what's ahead of us. And we're going to be paralyzed by depression, which is trying to hold on to what's behind us. So it's going to make it impossible to live in the truth. We've been talking a lot about truth of what we are in and we find ourselves in. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity to really leave old things behind from the brokenness of a Western church, which has caused a lot of spiritual and psychological wounds on a generation. And we better acknowledge that and show up for a conversation about that. Right? Or we may be seduced into discussing politics. And politics is only policies that come from the imaginations of man. We have to really understand government because the political discourse is downstream from government, individual self-government. And even the mess and the politics that I just mentioned of the church, that's still downstream from individual self-government. And I think we all need to take personal responsibility for what we know about history, government, and education in the context of ancient history, American history, and universal history. So there's this measure of responsibility I think we're being invited into. And if we can step into communion with ourselves and with each other and build solid communities, rest community around this, I think we can begin to have significant conversations, not debates. We don't need to keep debating each other. I don't feel called to what Charlie did with excellence. To remember that Charlie Kirk went into the public forum. He went into the heart of the storm, which is what's happening in education. And he exposed a growing trend of confusion, chaos, and disease that was not in alignment with American history, with ancient history, American history, and education. And so he was called to go into the eye of that storm. That's not what I'm suggesting people do. That's not what we're called into. We're called into a different thing. We're inviting people to have conversations around relational, emotional, and spiritual truths. And at the heart of the storm is the battle that really rages within each of us individually. And if we don't calm those storms with integrity, with love for our very constitution, God made us like him, and the relationship we have with ourselves and our own emotional chaos and the spiritual realities. And if we don't step into truth of what's happening within us, it's going to be hard to show up with each other in the context of our relationships and our spheres of influence with integrity to have meaningful conversations about what's true and what's not. So we're not inviting people into a debate. We're inviting people into a conversation. Charlie invited people into a debate so they could displace confusion, chaos, and disease and maybe have conversations. We don't start in that place. We start in the place of conversations. And I think all are important, but I think now when there's so much fear and anxiety and depression, people are terrified. We want to step in and say, hey, we can have meaningful conversation about these competing ideas without disparaging anybody. And that's the platform I invite people to consider. And by way of modern therapists, I think Gabor Mate really speaks to this in powerful ways because of his own story. This is not our darkest hour. In fact, this is our finest moment. Because of giants that have gone before us in history and government and in education. We can draw from things they saw 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years before us. They saw this day arriving in America. We can draw from them and engage each other in thoughtful conversations that can be integritous. And we can begin to experience why the greatest leader that ever lived reconciled the mess that evolved out of the garden, the confusion, the chaos, and the disease with what? Propaganda then, and confusion then. He restored that, and he can invite us into this place of rest because we can learn things we never imagined and discover things that are mysterious beyond our comprehension, and we can live free. The invitation to rest was not a practical or convenient one. It was one into reconciling the conflict that we intuitively have within ourselves. Relational, emotional, and spiritual truth that rages within us. And the invitation comes with the promise that if you want to learn about these things, you can be free. And there's never a more beautiful time to learn about these things. Because science, technology, truth, ancient history, American history, universal history, it's all converging, and nothing can help bring us it all together like AI, who also has an amazing propensity to deceive. So you've got to take personal responsibility for reading primary sources. And if you don't have the bandwidth for that, that's okay. Listen to the quiet, still voice in your heart that says, psst, 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 come over here. I made you to be known, seen, and understood by me because I made you like me. Come, if you're weary and you're heavy burden, and I will give you rest for your souls. Come follow me. The gift of rest is the promise of freedom.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about rest, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of Rest. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of rest, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.